They say that blood is thicker than water. However, they never tell you how readily blood stains the floor when the guy holding the knife is the one who saved your life. They never tell you that the people who share your blood are the ones who will hurt and poke you the most. I'm in a hallway outside courtroom 4B that smells of old floor wax and despair. In my hand lies a manila envelope containing the ability to save my father's legacy or destroy my mother's soul. I stare at her. She glances at me. And for the first time in 28 years, I don't see my parents. I see a predator. To understand why my mother is suing me, you must first comprehend the man standing between us. My father, Elias, was a man of silence. He communicated in the language of earth and cedar. When he died, the silence in this house turned into a scream. I am Elena. I was always the reliable person, the daughter who stayed behind as my brother, Julian, chased neon lights throughout the city. I changed the bandages on my father's hands and disregarded the stack of final notice envelopes on the kitchen counter. I thought my mother, Martha, and I were a team. I assumed we were two women mourning one magnificent man. The tension did not begin with the funeral. It began at the kitchen table 3 days later. Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, did not look me in the eye when he entered. He gazed at the floor. He looked at his briefcase. He ignored the woman sitting across from me, my mother, who was already sporting a beautiful diamond tennis bracelet she couldn't afford. "The estate," Henderson began, his voice cracking as if he didn't want to upset anyone, "is complicated." That was all he said at first, before Martha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Elena promised me the mansion, Thomas. He promised me the accounts. There is no requirement for a formal reading. Simply hand over the keys." But Henderson did not look at her. He stared at me. "Elena, your father left a codicil, a private trust. Everything has been transferred to your name, including the land, any residual liquid assets, and the homestead deed, solely." The silence that ensued was not peaceful. It wasn't necessarily because you didn't have anything to say. It was because you realized that no matter what you said, it wouldn't change anything. It was the kind of silence that occurs just before a storm smashes an oak tree in half. Before I turned to face my mother, I felt the intensity in her stare. "Everything?" she whispered. It was not a question. It was a declaration of war. The house turned into a tomb for a week. Despite living in the same area, we were in different worlds. I made an effort to clarify. I explained to her that the funds would be used for taxes, repairs, and maintaining the legacy. She would never want anything, I assured her. But Martha was not interested in a stipend. She desired authority, the kind that prevents you from allowing others to lead fulfilling lives. I began to find items. There were hints that my father had been lying for years. I discovered a ledger beneath the study's floorboards, a personal ledger, not the farm's. Near the end, my father's handwriting became unsteady. October 12th, Martha went to Atlantic City once again with the seed money. I had to get a second mortgage. November 4th, she is requesting the trust. I can't give it to her. To see the sparks, she will set the house on fire. He wasn't being harsh. He was acting as a guardian. He knew my mother's illness, a desire for high stakes that could not be satiated by peace grown on a farm. There was no shout that caused the inciting incident to occur. There was a knock. A man in a cheap suit handed me the documents. Elena Vance versus Martha Vance. The fee? Mental incapacity and undue influence. I had tricked a dying, senile man into disinheriting his wife. My own mother was reporting this to the state of Ohio. She came for more than just the cash. She was targeting my persona. She was accusing me of being a monster. This is the dark part of the story. I have to do the one thing I vowed never to do in order to defend myself. I must expose her. I have to testify before a judge about my mother's compulsive gambling and how she depleted my father's life savings. If I tell the truth, the farm will be saved, but any remaining dignity she may have will be destroyed.
If I say nothing, she gets the money, spends it within 6 months, and we both become homeless. How would you respond? To preserve the land your father sacrificed his life for, would you betray the woman who reared you? The gavel hasn't fallen yet, and the secrets in this family go deeper than a bank account. Would you allow her to ruin you both out of misplaced loyalty? You won't believe what we found in my father's safe deposit box. It completely changes my understanding of how I was born.
Subscribe to see how this unfolds. I want to personally thank you for joining the KinJustice Chronicles family. Your support in subscribing and liking helps us bring these hidden truths to light. Before you go, please comment below with where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you personally and see just how far our story is traveling across the world. Your voice is part of this journey now. Once again, thank you. Now let's continue. The smell of lemon wax and old paper always reminds me of my father's study, but that morning, the scent was suffocating. Mr. Henderson sat behind the massive oak desk, his spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose as he fumbled with the wax seal of a heavy manila envelope. My mother, Martha, sat to my left. She had spent the morning meticulously applying her grief mask, a layer of expensive foundation, a muted rose lipstick, and a black silk veil that she kept pinned back just enough for people to see her damp eyes. She looked every bit the tragic widow, but her fingers were betraying her. They were tapping a frantic, rhythmic code against the arm of her velvet chair. I sat beside her in my charcoal scarf, feeling like a ghost in my own home, still numb from the sound of dirt hitting my father's casket just days prior. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He began to read the formal preamble, a long-winded list of legalities that seemed to stretch the tension in the room to a breaking point. Martha's tapping stopped. She leaned forward, her perfume, something sharp and floral, filling the space between us. When Henderson finally reached the distribution of assets, his voice dropped an octave, losing its professional edge. He looked at the document, then at me, then back at the paper, as if the ink might rearrange itself if he stared hard enough. He read the words slowly. To my daughter Elena, I bequeath the entirety of the Vance estate, including the homestead, the northern acreage, and all associated trust accounts, to be held in her name alone, for the preservation of our family's history. The silence that followed was visceral. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was powerful. It was the kind of silence that speaks volumes on its own. I felt the air leave the room. I looked at my mother, expecting confusion or perhaps a shared look of shock, but what I saw was the first visible crack in her carefully constructed composure. Her face didn't crumple in sadness, it hardened. The grief mask slipped, revealing a sharp, predatory coldness in her eyes that I had never seen directed at me. Her mouth opened slightly, a small, jagged gasp escaping her throat, and for a fleeting second, her hands shook so violently she had to grip the hem of her black skirt to hide them. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she simply stared at the paper in Henderson's hand as if she were trying to set it on fire with her mind. "There must be a mistake," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. It wasn't the voice of a mother, it was the voice of a woman who had just seen her lifeline severed. Henderson shook his head gravely, offering the document for her inspection, but she didn't take it. She just kept staring at me, her eyes tracing the lines of my face, as if looking for a stranger. The man who had been the buffer between her impulses and the reality of our finances was gone, and in his place, he had left me, the daughter he knew would hold the line. The walk from the study to the kitchen felt like miles. By the time we reached the heart of the house, the mask was back on, though it was crooked. Martha waited until I was pouring a glass of water, the sound of the tap filling the heavy quiet, before she spoke. Her voice had shifted. The ice was gone, replaced with a soft, trembling vulnerability that felt entirely practiced. She sat at the kitchen table, the very table where my father used to go over the grain prices, and reached out to cover my hand with hers. Her skin was unnaturally cold. "Elena, darling," she began, her eyes brimming with a sudden, fresh layer of tears,
You know your father was confused near the end. The illness, the medication, he didn't mean to put this burden on you. He knew I've always handled the household. This money, it's for the family. It's to keep us whole. You know I have certain obligations, debts your father left behind that need to be settled quietly. For the sake of his memory, we need to move that trust into my name immediately. I looked down at her hand, then at the final notice envelopes I had hidden in the junk drawer earlier that morning. I felt a cold knot of resolve forming in my chest. I pulled my hand away slowly, leaning back against the counter. I want to help, Mom, truly, but if I'm going to manage the estate the way Dad asked, I need to see exactly what these obligations are. If there are debts, I'll pay them directly from the trust. I just need a breakdown, a list, something to show the accountants. The transformation was instantaneous. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a flush of indignant anger that rose from her neck to her cheeks. She stood up, her heels clicking like a countdown. Then she stopped and looked me dead in the eye, her expression softening into a look of profound, staged disappointment. Your father didn't leave debts, Elena. I was trying to protect his pride. The truth is, he made some very poor investments in his final months. He lost a significant portion of our savings. If word gets out, the Vance name will be a laughingstock. I'm trying to save his reputation. I need that money to pay back the people he borrowed from. I'm doing this for him.
It was a masterful performance. It was the first lie, the first official brick in the wall she was building between us. I knew it was a lie because I'd seen the ledger in the study. I knew my father hadn't lost a dime. He had been the one desperately trying to fill the hole she was digging. But as I watched her stand there, draped in her widow's weeds and her false narrative, I realized that the woman I called mother was gone. In her place was a stranger who was willing to tarnish a dead man's memory just to get her hands on the keys to the vault. The justice my father had intended was already beginning to feel like a curse. And as she turned her back on me to walk out of the room, I knew this was only the beginning of the end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and thank you for subscribing and liking this video. Please comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The grass at the cemetery was still that vibrant, a place full of people who thought they had more time, places of profound sorrow. I was kneeling by my father's headstone, the cold granite biting into my palms as I tried to pull a few stubborn weeds from the base of the plot. It was the only place I felt I could breathe without the air being heavy with my mother's silent accusations and the suffocating tension of the farmhouse. I was wearing my charcoal scarf, wrapping it tight against a wind that seemed to blow straight from the afterlife. I had come to find peace, to ask a man who couldn't answer why he had left me with a sword in my hand and a target on my back. But the peace was shattered by the sound of heavy boots coming from towards me on the gravel path. I didn't look up at first, assuming it was a groundskeeper or another mourner, until a shadow fell directly across the fresh mound of earth. A man in a cheap, wrinkled suit stood there, looking down at me with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and boredom. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply held out a thick white envelope. When I didn't take it, he dropped it into the dirt, right where I had been weeding. "Elena Vance, you've been served," he muttered, turning on his heel before I could even find my voice. I stared at the envelope. My name was typed in a cold serif font, but the signature at the bottom of the filing belonged to my mother. She had chosen this moment, this sacred, quiet space of mourning, to officially declare me her enemy. I tore the paper open, my hands shaking so violently that the legal jargon blurred before my eyes. Undue influence, mental incompetence. She wasn't just asking for the money anymore. She was claiming I had poisoned my father's mind against her. She was using the sight of his rest as the starting line for her crusade. The disrespect felt like a physical blow to the chest, a final confirmation that to Martha, family was no longer a bond. It was a casualty of war. I didn't go back to the house that afternoon. I couldn't bear to look at her across the dinner table, knowing she had sent a stranger to ambush me at my father's grave. Instead, I drove into the city to meet a man named Elias Thorne, a private investigator recommended by a friend who specialized in delicate family matters.
Thorne was a man who looked like he was made of iron and old secrets, and when I laid out the ledger I'd found and the lawsuit I'd been served, he didn't blink. "You want to know where the money went," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but you're scared of what you'll find." I told him I wasn't scared of the truth. I was scared of the lies I had been living in. I gave him what little I had, the names of the banks, the dates of my mother's weekend trips, and the keys to my father's old workshop. The workshop was a small, weathered building at the edge of our property, a place that smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and the honest labor of a man who loved to build things. My mother never stepped foot in there. She called it a shack for a man with no ambition, but to me, it was a sanctuary. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread that sat like lead in my stomach, I began to tear the place apart. I checked the rafters, the tool chests, and the hollowed-out legs of his workbench. It took hours of searching through the remnants of his life, half-finished birdhouses and rusted wrenches, before I noticed a floorboard that didn't quite sit flush under the heavy cast-iron stove. With a crowbar and a prayer, I pried the wood back. Tucked into a waterproof casing was a thick, leather-bound book. This wasn't the farm's official record. This was my father's confession. I sat on the cold workshop floor and began to read, the flashlight beam as I turned the pages. It was all there, decades of betrayal documented in his steady looping script. June 14th, Martha took $3,000 from the tax account, said it was for emergencies, saw a receipt from a casino in her coat pocket. August 22nd, she's forged my signature on the credit line again. I can't stop her without the police, and I can't call the police on my wife. As I delved deeper, the secret ledger revealed a horror I hadn't expected. It wasn't just a gambling addiction. My father had uncovered a web of secret loans and high-interest debts that Martha had taken out in my name, using my social security number when I was barely 18. She had been mortgaging my future before I even knew I had one. The realization hit me harder than the lawsuit had. My father hadn't left me the trust because he loved me more than her. He had left it as a shield because he knew she would devour me if he didn't. He had spent his final years working himself into an early grave just to stay ahead of her appetite. And now he was calling from the pages of this book for me to finish the job he couldn't. I held the ledger to my chest, the smell of his old workshop surrounding me, and I knew the war was no longer about a farm or a bank account. It was about survival. The dust danced in the pale light of the workshop, but the air felt heavy, as if the secrets I had just unearthed were physically pressing against my lungs. I climbed out of the crawlspace, clutching the leather-bound ledger like a holy relic, only to find a silhouette standing in the doorway, blocking the moonlight. It was my brother, Julian. He was leaning against the doorframe with that practiced, effortless grace that had always allowed him to slide through life while I did the heavy lifting. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than a month's worth of feed for the cattle, his hair slicked back, a smug smile playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't look like a man who had just buried his father. He looked like a man who had just seen a winning hand in a high-stakes game. "He's always digging, Elena," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with a false brotherly concern. "Dad always said you had a nose for the dirt, but maybe some things are better left buried." He stepped into the room, the smell of expensive cologne and stale cigarettes clashing with the honest scent of cedar. He didn't ask about the lawsuit or the funeral. He asked about the fairness of it all. He began to talk about how the family legacy belonged to both of us, how our mother was fragile and needed a man's hand to guide her finances. As he spoke, I saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes, the same sharp greed I had just seen in Martha's. I realized then that the lawsuit wasn't just my mother's desperation, it was Julian's design. He had been the whisper in her ear, feeding her paranoia, telling her that I was the one who had turned my father against her, all while promising her that he could fix the legal mess if she just gave him control of the settlement. He wasn't there to protect her. He was there to harvest the remains of our family once she was done tearing it apart. He was the shadow behind her every move, the silent partner in a betrayal that went deeper than I ever imagined. I drove to the city the next morning to meet with my own legal counsel, a woman named Sarah Vance, no relation, though she fought with the tenacity of kin. Her office was a glass and steel cage overlooking the heart of the city, a place where emotions were stripped away and replaced with cold, hard strategy. I laid the secret ledger on her desk and told her about Julian's sudden appearance. Sarah didn't look surprised. She looked at me with a professional, clinical pity that made my skin cold. "Elena," she said, leaning forward and tenting her fingers, "the evidence in this book is definitive. It proves your father's state of mind and your mother's financial history. But if you want to win this, if you want to keep the farm and your father's legacy, you have to understand the cost. To discredit the lawsuit when the plaintiff is your own mother, we can't just play defense. We have to go on the offensive." She began to outline a strategy that felt like a slow-motion execution. To discredit the lawsuit, I would have to enter every sordid detail of my mother's gambling addiction into the public record. I would have to stand in a courtroom and describe, under oath, the times she stole from the grocery money, the way she forged my signature, and the thousands of dollars she bled from a dying man's accounts. I would have to label her as a compulsive liar and a danger to the estate. "To save the inheritance," Sarah said, her voice sounding too strict, "you have to destroy her character. You have to make sure she never has a shred of credibility in this town. You have to choose the land or the woman you raised. There is no middle ground." The moral dilemma sat in my stomach like a stone. I thought of the charcoal scarf around my neck, a gift from her years ago, and then I thought of the blue summons she dropped in the dirt of my father's grave. I was being asked to choose between my father's life's work and my mother's dignity, and as I looked out at the city skyline, I realized that in the world of kin justice, there are no clean hands. I gazed so calmly at the fluorescent lights of the conference room, felt a predatory energy that made the air feel thin. I sat at one end of the long conference table, my hands folded tightly over the charcoal fabric of my scarf, watching the door. When my mother finally walked in, flanked by Julian and a lawyer whose smile was as sharp as a razor, she didn't look like the woman who sued me. She looked like a victim. She walked with a slight limp I'd never seen before, her eyes already pale with a fragile redness, clutching a lace handkerchief as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The court reporter began the oath, the words, "the whole truth and nothing but
the truth," hanging in the air like a threat. As the questioning began, Martha put on a performance that would have broken a stranger's heart. She spoke of her years of devotion to my father, of the sacrifices she made while I was away at school, and how my sudden control over the money was a cruel shock to a grieving widow. When her lawyer asked her how she felt about the trust, she began to sob, soft, rhythmic gasps that filled the room. Julian reached out to pat her hand, casting a look of pure, fabricated disgust in my direction. But I wasn't looking at her handkerchief. I was looking at her eyes. Through the gaps in her fingers, I saw it, the cold, steady calculation of a gambler checking the house's cards. Her eyes weren't wet with grief. They were dry and sharp, scanning the room to see if the lawyers were buying the act. She wasn't a mother losing a daughter. She was a player trying to bluff her way into a pot she hadn't earned. The betrayal of that look, that moment of pure artifice in the face of our family's ruin, burned away the last of my hesitation. I realized then that the woman I was trying to protect had died a long time ago, replaced by someone who used tears as a weapon. I returned to the farm that night feeling hollowed out, the sound of her staged weeping still ringing in my ears. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered back to the workshop, the only place where the air didn't feel tainted by the deposition. I began to organize the mess I had made during my earlier search, sliding tools back into their places and sweeping away the sawdust. It was as I was moving a heavy rusted drill press near the back wall that I saw it, a small magnetic key box stuck to the underside of the iron frame. Inside wasn't a key, but a single yellowed envelope with my name written on it in a script so bold it looked like it had been carved into the paper. I opened it with trembling fingers, the scent of my father's tobacco finally reaching me from across the divide. It was a letter, dated only weeks before his passing. Elena, it began, if you are reading this, the storm I feared has finally broken. I know the weight I've put on your shoulders is heavy, and I know you are likely questioning why I didn't just walk away or settle the score myself. But I stayed because I loved the land, and I stayed because I hoped your mother would find her way back to us. I was wrong. The paper crinkled under my grip as I read the final, haunting lines that would define the rest of my life. The farm is more than dirt and wood. It is the only truth we have left. Protect the land, Elena, even from those who live on it, especially from those who claim to love it while they try to sell it piece by piece. Do not let your heart betray your duty. You are the only one left with eyes clear enough to see the cliff. I sat there in the dark, the letter resting against my chest, and felt the finality of his words settle into my bones. He hadn't just given me an inheritance, he had given me a command. The kin justice he sought wasn't about revenge, it was about preservation. Armed with his voice, I knew I could no longer afford the luxury of mercy. The air in the courtroom was stagnant, thick with the scent of old wood, the anticipation of a life about to be dismantled. My mother sat across the aisle, her face a masterpiece of practiced fragility, while Julian leaned back with a smug confidence that suggested he already smelled the victory. When I was called to the stand, the walk felt like a march toward a cliff. I carried the leather-bound ledger in my hands, its weight more than just paper and ink. It was my father's final, silent testimony. My lawyer began the questioning, and for 20 minutes, I laid out the truth with a surgical precision that left the room in a stunned, hollow silence. I spoke of the forged signatures, the midnight trips to the casino, and the systematic draining of my father's life force. I watched the color drain from Martha's face, the grief mask finally shattering beyond repair, as I read the dates and the dollar amounts from this secret ledger. Julian's smirk vanished, replaced with a frantic, sweating panic as he realized the evidence was insurmountable. But just as the judge prepared to rule, I asked for a moment to speak outside the legal framework. I looked directly at my mother, not with hatred, but with a profound, weary clarity. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted to stop the bleeding. I offered a settlement that caught even the lawyers off guard. The farm, the land, and the capital would remain locked in an ironclad trust under my sole management, but my mother would receive a generous monthly allowance for her living expenses and, most importantly, for mandatory therapy. She would be cared for, she would be housed, and she would be fed, but she would never touch the principal again. I was stripping her of her power to ruin us, replacing her control with a safety net she hadn't earned, but desperately needed. The courtroom was silent as she realized what this meant. I had saved her from herself, but in doing so, I had officially become the parent, and she the child. She looked at me then, and for the first time, there were no calculated tears, only the cold realization that the game was over. She signed the papers with a trembling hand. The war for the Vance estate was finished. The drive back to the farm was the loneliest journey of my life. The victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like an amputation. I stood on the wide wraparound porch as the sun began to fade, painting the fields in shades of bruised purple and gold. The land was safe, the deed was in my name, and the legacy my father had nearly died to protect was finally secure from the predators within our bloodline. But as I turned to look at the farmhouse, the windows were dark and the silence was absolute. My mother had moved into a small apartment in town, and Julian had disappeared the moment the money was out of reach, leaving me as the sole guardian of a kingdom of ghosts. I pulled my charcoal scarf tighter against the evening chill, feeling the weight of the key in my pocket. I had achieved the justice my father asked for. I had protected the land from those who lived on it. But as I stood there in the quiet, watching the shadows across the porch, I realized that the hardest part of kin justice isn't the fight. It's the silence that follows when you've won everything but lost the family you were trying to save. The land was mine, but the home was gone.
In the end, I kept my promise to my father. The land is silent now and the soil is safe. But walking through these empty rooms, I've realized that justice is a heavy thing to carry. It's a victory that leaves you standing alone on a porch, wondering if the cost of the truth was higher than the lie we were living. Maybe some of you are going through your own KinJustice right now. Maybe you're the one holding the line for a family that's trying to cross it. If you are, know this: you're not alone, and your boundaries are not a betrayal. They are your survival. This journey is just beginning, and there are so many more stories hidden behind closed doors that need to be told. Please subscribe to see how this unfolds, and thank you for being here, for liking, and for being part of this community. It truly means the world. Before you click away, please comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'll be in the comments tonight, and I would love to say hello to you personally. It helps me know how far our story is traveling, and that the message is reaching the right people. Until next time, keep seeking the truth no matter where it's hidden.